Hello, this is the Death Row and Executions channel. I'm Paco Rivera. I invite you to also follow me on Facebook for updates and more Death Row news. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. Also, check out my other channel here on YouTube called The Maximum Sentence, where I cover recent crimes and convictions. There will be a link for that as well. Edward Zakrzewski II was originally from Michigan. Born in 1965, he's now 60 years old as he sits on death row. After a short stint in college, he enlisted in the military, the United States Air Force. While he was stationed at a base in Montana, or possibly Idaho, depending on which report you read, he met a woman working as a waitress. Her name was Sylvia, and Sylvia was originally from South Korea. Sylvia had recently ended a relationship with another military man that she was married to. She and that man had even gone to South Korea together to visit her family, and it was reported that her family did not like him at all. And soon after that they were back in the United States, she broke it off with him and they divorced. There were no children from that marriage. Edward Zakrzewski and Sylvia dated, fell in love, and got married. And about a year later, sometime around 1987, they had their first child, a son they named Edward Zakrzewski III. Sylvia had always let it be known how homesick she was and how much she wanted to be back in South Korea. And as luck would have it, in 1989, Zakrzewski received orders that he was being transferred to a base in South Korea. Sylvia, of course, was thrilled. And after moving to South Korea, as it turns out, Sylvia's parents met Edward Zakrzewski, and unlike that first military husband that she had presented to them, they loved Edward Zakrzewski. While in South Korea, Sylvia had become pregnant again, and she gave birth to a daughter they named Anna. Unfortunately for Sylvia, in 1992, Zakrzewski was transferred again, this time to Elgin Air Force Base in Florida, back in the States. Zakrzewski, Sylvia, and their two children moved into a home in the city of Mary Esther in Florida in Okaloosa County. And over time, Sylvia became miserable again and homesick again, and she let her feelings be known to her husband, and the marriage began to deteriorate when he wouldn't do anything about it. On the morning of June 9th of the year 1994, now 29-year-old Edward Zakrzewski left to work at the Elgin Air Force Base, and soon after, he received a phone call from his 7-year-old son, Edward. During the conversation, little Edward told his father that his mom said that she was going to divorce him and take the children back to South Korea. Now, it's not clear if Sylvia had instructed her son to deliver that message to his father, even though some reports state that is exactly what happened. After that phone call, during Zakrzewski's lunch break, he went to the base's exchange store, and there he purchased a machete. Yeah, he bought a machete on his lunch break and then went back to work. After leaving work, Zakrzewski put the machete in his car and then went to a bar where he had a drink with a friend who was a military veteran. That friend would later say that while having a beer at the bar, Zakrzewski had mentioned during their conversation how he wondered what it must be like to kill someone. Later that evening, Zakrzewski arrived at the house and took his newly purchased machete inside. Everyone was gone from the house, so he waited. And sometime later, Sylvia and the children arrived at the house. Zakrzewski waited inside the bedroom for Sylvia, but he didn't have the machete in his hand. He was now holding a crowbar. But Sylvia never went into the bedroom, so he went looking for her and found her seated on a couch in the living room with her eyes closed. She was resting. He then struck her as hard as he can in the back of the head, causing her to completely lose consciousness. Zakrzewski then dragged Sylvia into their bedroom and continued beating her with the crowbar. But that might not have been enough, because he then put a rope around her neck and strangled her. He then went into the bathroom and called his son Edward into the bathroom to brush his teeth. And while little Edward was brushing his teeth, Zakrzewski began hacking at the boy's head and neck and back with the machete until his son was dead. Zakrzewski then placed the boy's dead body in the bathtub. Zakrzewski then called for his 5-year-old daughter to come into the bathroom, and he did the same thing with her, ultimately placing the girl's body on top of her brother's dead body in the bathtub. Zakrzewski then went back into the bedroom, dragged his wife's body into the bathroom, and slashed her neck with the machete because he wasn't sure if she was dead yet. He then placed her body in the bathtub on top of her 2 children. 3 dead, bloody bodies stacked in the bathtub. What a sight that must have been when discovered. Zakrzewski eventually washed up, changed into some clean clothing, and went to a bar where he drank heavily for several hours until he was terribly intoxicated. He went back to his car and fell asleep in the car, and police going by spotted him in there. They went over and spoke to Zakrzewski for a few minutes, and realizing that he was still terribly drunk, they took his car keys and told him to pick up his keys at the station later when he's sober. But a few hours later, when daylight broke, he went back to the house. He didn't have his keys because police had taken them. So he broke a window and the screen to get inside, changed into his work uniform, and drove Sylvia's car back to the bar's parking lot where he had still been parked. Zakrzewski then used a spare car key for his car to drive to work, but he snuck out early, sometime about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he went to a bank where he withdrew about $5,000. Sometime later, Zakrzewski made his way to the airport in Orlando and boarded a plane to Hawaii. Once in Hawaii, he became friends with a couple. The husband was a pastor, and they were running a religious commune. Edward Zakrzewski lied and told them that his name was Michael Green. The pastor and his wife allowed Zakrzewski to stay in a shack on their property in exchange for doing handyman work around the property instead of paying rent. Meanwhile, on Monday, June 13th, Elgin Air Force Base sent some soldiers to the home of Edward Zakrzewski because he had been AWOL. They also contacted the sheriff's office to meet them there. Once at the house, sheriff's deputies and the Air Force soldiers saw a broken window, and some of them made their way inside, and they discovered the horrific sight of 3 dead bodies, Sylvia and her 2 children, in the bathtub, in the bathroom. Of course, Zakrzewski immediately became the prime suspect, and the manhunt for him began. Like I said, those bodies were discovered on Monday, June 13th. Now, bear in mind that the night before the 3 bodies were discovered, the night before, on Sunday, June 12th, the dead bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were discovered outside her home in California after both were stabbed to death. And by Monday morning, O.J. Simpson would become the prime suspect. And on that same Monday, June 13th, about the same time that the bodies of Sylvia and her children were found dead in a bathtub in Florida, the famous slow-speed pursuit of O.J. Simpson was taking place, and TV stations around the country had broadcast live coverage of that pursuit, which was watched by around 95 million people in this country. I think it's important to mention this because the entire country, practically the entire world, were captivated by that case in which O.J. Simpson was declared the suspect. And as a result, this horrible, horrific, triple murder in Florida received very little attention from the media. But we're going to talk about it today and make sure that the 3 innocent victims, that included a 7-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl, are not forgotten. So for the next 4 months, there was an intense manhunt for Edward Zakrzewski. The FBI and U.S. Marshals were involved, and authorities were looking for him all over the country. His family's home in Michigan and wherever he had other acquaintances were checked and being watched. Nobody had a hint that he had fled to Hawaii because he had no connections or relations with anyone there until he met the pastor and his wife after fleeing from Florida. And on the night of October 14th, 1994, the television show Unsolved Mysteries aired a broadcast featuring Edward Zakrzewski as a wanted man in a triple murder. That show was watched by the pastor and his wife in Hawaii, and Zakrzewski was there in the living room watching the show with them. And the pastor mentioned to Zakrzewski how much he looked like the person shown in the photo on Unsolved Mysteries. It appeared from reports that Zakrzewski laughed it off and said something like, "Yeah, that guy looks like me, but it wasn't me." However, the pastor and his wife were not convinced, and they made plans to confront Zakrzewski about it again in the morning to be sure. This was now October 15th. The morning of October 15th, 1994. The pastor and his wife went to visit Zakrzewski at that shack on their property, but he wasn't there. He was no longer on their property. And they later learned that Zakrzewski had walked into a Hawaii police station that morning and turned himself in. Seeing his face on television the night before and knowing now that it was only a matter of time, Zakrzewski may have thought that it would look a lot better on him to turn himself in voluntarily than have a SWAT team, for instance, hauling him in. Zakrzewski was later extradited from Maui, Hawaii to Okaloosa County in Florida, and on March 19th, 1996, almost 2 years after the murders, Zakrzewski pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder, and the following month, a judge sentenced him to death. What is really tragic about this case is that Zakrzewski had told a neighbor in Mary Esther, Florida, several times, the neighbor would later say. He told the neighbor that if his wife ever tries to leave him, that he will kill her and the children. And that neighbor never said anything about it until after it happened. People, if you see something or hear something, say something. Please remember to hit the subscribe button for more death row and upcoming execution stories so that you're alerted when the next one comes out. You can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. My name is Paco Rivera. Take care. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.